Welcome, welcome, welcome to Week Old Beans episode 30. We're 30 episodes into this. I'm Ardot, and I have with me here, introduce yourself.
I am Fowler. I am the other host of Week Old Beans, the best podcast in America.
It's a little bit strong, but okay, fine. So, this is the second attempt we have at trying to film this podcast. The first time we had some technical difficulties, so hopefully our conversation will be as fresh as the first time. We're both awake. Last time we filmed, we were not awake. We were not awake at all. So hopefully this'll be it. Why don't you tell everybody what we're talking about today, Fowler?
Analyze the legacy of Thomas Jefferson and talk about how we remember historical figures.
You want to go a little bit deeper into that? That was very brief.
I'm tickling them a little bit, titillating them.
Don't say that word ever again, please. It's not a word we need to say to the viewers. We're not titillating it. We're not titillating anything of y'all's. I promise you.
We're ravishing the viewers.
No. No sex references. Fucking naughty asshole.
There goes your non-existent demonetization.
Shut up. Shut the fuck up. I clicked not made for children on every episode. So we were never monetized to begin with. We're not losing anything that we do, you can't lose what you don't have. But no, we're going to talk about Thomas Jefferson's legacy. Now, should we do like a character profile on our... The fuck is that a troll? Should we do a character profile for those of our international friends who are not aware of Thomas Jefferson? But I don't know. We're way too American for this podcast. Like I just assume like, oh, everybody knows.
We should still summarize him before we talk about him, I think.
I'm gonna let you do that because you've actually read the biography. I've not.
The Sage of Monticello, the second vice president, the third president, he was a politician. He was the beginning of the states' rights, limited government, kind of laissez-faire liberalism. He famously owned slaves and was a hypocrite on that regard. And he distrusted the centralization of power, both economically through the banks and politically through the Washington bureaucrats. He was in many ways the first ideological populist and very controversial to this day. Probably the most controversial of the founding fathers.
Yeah, Jefferson is held in high emotion by many, many people, in large part because of his slave owning and the hypocrisy of him being a man who spoke very aggressively about the idea of liberty and justice and the people and freedom and, the people being free from a tyrannical sort of government or tyrannical institutions. But he did not extend that to those he considered to be inferior. Although there are writings that he has of him believing slavery to be a moral evil, but that idea clashed heavily with the profit incentive that existed back then if you were someone that owned slaves. So it was less so a complete and total I guess belief in the system of slavery morally, and more so I don't believe in it morally, but it does make me a lot of money, in the same way that a lot of people talk about how they really care about child slaves, but they do own iPhones, and we're all guilty of that. So I'm not impugning, I'm not making a direct impugnment of behavior there, but I'm drawing a comparison between sort of how we today will obviously say that we morally oppose child slavery and sort of the usage of children to harvest minerals in like the Congo, but we all indulge very aggressively in the systems that perpetuate that. And it is a sort of it's a moral question that is not managed to evade us in any way, shape, or form, whether it's slavery or another form of slavery. So controversial, brings up a lot of emotion.
In some ways, Jefferson's legacy remains Jefferson's legacy remains very controversial because a lot of the debates that Jefferson had, not the slavery one, obviously, hopefully,
even
but a lot of the things he debated, the size of government, central power, government overreach, a lot of these are still ideas we're still debating about today.
yeah, which in that respect, he's contrasted with his arch nemesis Alexander Hamilton, who you'll know from the musical Hamilton by Lin-Manuel Miranda. Fantastic piece of work, by the way. But Hamilton was the opposite of Jefferson. He believed in strong centralized power. We did a podcast on him, I think 2 episodes ago. So if you want to know more about Hamilton as a figure, check that out. But we're gonna focus on his arch nemesis. Jesus, like it's a fucking anime. His
To
arch
be fair to Hamilton, he had a lot of arch nemesis. He was fighting Burr, he was fighting Jefferson, he was fighting Adams. He basically was just throwing hands at every single figure in his time period.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I I appreciate that. Um, I like a man with passion. I feel like we don't have that today. Like our current politicians don't fucking hate each other in the same way, and I really think that we're losing out on uh, we're losing out on good politics. Because all the politicians are friends with each other. Um, except unless you're Matt Gates, everybody hates you if you're Matt Gates. Um, I Fowler and I have talked about our begrudging sort of endearment with Gates for his absolute psycho behavior, but um,
We'll see if he wins re-election. If he doesn't win re-election and he loses, we'll have to do a special episode where
oh no,
we
yeah,
go
talking
over.
about well when going real goes bad, like being real goes wrong.
But the question, I guess, that we're trying to reach is like, what do you do with a figure like Jefferson, who is so controversial and is so tied into kind of the lifeblood of the country, and not always in a good way? How do you remember him, and how should you approach him?
Yeah, what's the appropriate way, I guess, to discuss him in public discourse? Because this topic came up, and it's something I've really been thinking about since the I feel like we need to do an episode, a retrospective episode of 2020, Fowler. Because I feel like we're reaching a point where I don't feel like I'm going to get in trouble for talking about like the shit show that was Black Lives Matter and the protest. Because I feel like we've come to the conclusion that you know that what happened that there was a lot happening. A lot happened. There was a lot going on. Let's just say. And so but the removal of sort of statues, most of them Confederate statues, which I'm pretty like you can take all of them. I don't give a fuck. uh, um but I mean even the discussion of removals of statues of Jefferson because he was a slave owner, even discussions of I think we tried to do it with Washington. We tried to be like, how do we remember what? But you can't do that with the OG. He's the OG. He's the goat, bro. You can't do that with Washington. But with Jefferson, you can because Jefferson, his controversy kind of has surpassed whatever, or at least in the minds of many, whatever good he's done. Um, so that's really what spurred my interest in the topic of like what do you do with uncomfortable history, because that's what it is. It's uncomfortable history. I don't feel like I am the one who could sit here and pass a definitive judgment, and I can have my own opinions about it just like anybody else can. But I think the broader question is, okay, you have these historical figures that are part of historical discourse, and what do you do and how do you grapple with the uncomfortability of history, um, and how do you teach it in a way that is I don't want to say politically impartial, because I'm sure Fowler's going to get to that, right? Fowler, that how history is politicized.
Yeah, I mean, when you read any history, you have to be reticent of the fact that like who made the history and who benefits from the history. Like which figures are taken out because they're inconvenient in terms of like being pro-slavery or being anti-American in certain ways, and also who's removed from history because their ideas are so dangerous that the current establishment doesn't want you learning about them, like the Black Panthers, like Huey Long, you know, like the labor leaders in the early 20th century.
Yeah, it's history, is always used. I think there is a possibility for an individual to be impartial and sort of unbiased in their viewing of history. I think that's possible, but we're not really talking about individuals. We're talking about the way history is used socially. So, I guess what I would say is, or maybe what I'm concerned about always whenever I, think about the way we engage in history is, um, history should be used as a tool, or I guess it's been used as a tool. And, a lot of history is myth. A lot of history relies heavily on mythology, especially history that we don't have. Especially old history, ancient history. You're going back to the Revolutionary War. A lot of, a lot of those letters. I mean, most of them are in the care of the Library of Congress and individual historical associations. But you know, like even some of the accounts were written way after the actual fact. The actual historical fact, and um, so they were spiced up. I don't know if I told you, Fowler. I was reading. I read it because I was bored. The Life of Francis Marion.
I don't think we talked about that.
No, I read it. I really just wanted to read shit, and so I kind of read it in preparation for this episode, but also just to read it. But it was written in I think the 1800s by Sims. Oh God, what was his name? It's kind of historical nonfiction. It was considered for the longest time um, the defining book about Francis Marion. Who, for those of y'all who don't know, Francis Marion,
Oh, the Swamp Fox,
yes,
right?
he inspired the
Okay.
character of Mel Gibson in The Patriot. He was sort of the father of American guerrilla war. He was a 5 foot tall fucking French guy who fucking would run through the swamps of South Carolina, popping up behind British British lines like a I don't know like a fucking Jack in the Box, and then run away. But William Gilmore Simms wrote a book, and that book became kind of like for a long time the defining text of his life because um, he didn't really leave behind a lot of you know um, a lot of sort of details about his life. He was a slave owner. He married his cousin. He was 5 feet tall and broke his ankle jumping out of a fucking window to get out of a gentleman's party. Um, but even that book is largely historical fiction. Um, the William Gilmore Simms Fowler was the one who popularized and created the George Washington cherry tree myth.
Oh, yeah, I remember us
Yes,
talking about this
him.
now.
He was the one that did that. Um, and the George Washington cherry tree shit became part of American sort of historical, I don't want to say fact, but historical public fact for a long time. But it was a lie. Um, it was a lie created to paint George Washington in a very specific light. Um, and to sort of make him bigger than he probably actually was, although he was like 6'4", which back then or today would have been like fucking 6'12" or some shit like
I mean,
that.
a lot of our most successful politicians, they're the way we view them is the way they wanted us to be viewed. Abraham Lincoln is another great example of that, where he's, Honest Abe was a nickname he came up with himself. That wasn't something bestowed upon him impartially by historians.
Yeah, and we view him as the man who freed the slaves and the man who and we but even he had very uncomfortable views on race. I mean, he was not a egalitarian. He did not believe that black people and white people were equal by any means. He said it many times. Um, and I don't know if we necessarily teach that about him, but I think the way that we teach the Civil War, the the impression that we lead people to have um, was that, oh, he advocated for freeing slaves. He must have just really fucking loved black people. Not really. I mean, you back then could be an abolitionist and also not be very fond of those with a darker complexion. That's the complexity, because that was just the way it was back then. That was sort of the reality of that time period. Just because you wanted abolition didn't necessarily mean that you wanted a black neighbor. Um, Just because you wanted civil rights didn't mean that you wanted a black neighbor. We've progressed, so far compared to where we were even 50 years ago. And I think there is danger, and I want to hear your thoughts about this, Fowler, about overlaying our current biases onto historical fact and then making judgment based on that historical fact. Saying this person didn't have the beliefs that he or she should have had that would have made him or her an appropriate historical figure in today's time. Because, like I said, Abraham Lincoln, perfect example. Abraham Lincoln would have been a racist in today's society. He would have, his views on race would have deemed him unfit to serve as president of the United States. But back then, I mean, he was sort of I mean, in terms of abolition, he's considered the OG.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing because you have to perceive people within the historical lens from which they come from, but at the exact same time, you have to be able to evaluate them in a critical sense of like their faults and their failures. I do think that this debate can sometimes go off into an unproductive lens when you take people who did actually do useful things like Thomas Jefferson and tie them to other historical figures who, even within the context of their time, were monsters, like the Confederates, is a very good example of that, I think.
Yeah, yeah. It's why studying history and studying not just history, but what it was like, I think, is so important. Um, like not just studying the individual person and what they wrote, but studying, okay, what was the context around, the existence of, um, of America, of like what was America like back in that time period. And I think you start to see when you do that, just how things ebb and flow. I mean, there was a point in American history right before the Revolutionary War where you could be, say, like a free person of color and you could make something for yourself, just as Fowler pointed out for a little bit when we were talking before we filmed that there was a point right after the Civil War, a very brief point where, I mean, things were looking up in the South. You could be like a black representative, or you could be, a black landowner, and all of that tumbled down after Lincoln was assassinated and Johnson took control. But we don't really look at things linearly. It feels like it's very difficult for us to look at history as sort of a linear set of events, one after the other. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
Mm. Yeah, it's what's that Martin Luther King Jr. quote about the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, but bends slowly.
Yeah, and I think there are lessons you can learn. And I think seeing people's evolution of different viewpoints is very interesting. I think that's what needs to be studied. Like, how does somebody's viewpoint evolve over time? Washington, his valet was black, and his valet in Washington was a slave owner, and he believed very strongly from birth. I mean, he was raised in a slaveholding family, and he inherited slaves from his wife's side of the family as well. But um, he his views on slavery evolved as he when he fought the revolution, not just because he started to realize that it was probably hypocritical to throw off the shackles of Britain and then also have slaves, but he served very closely with his valet, who was black. Billy, I think it's William Lee was his valet, and the two. I mean, this is a man who William Lee saw Washington every single day of his life. I mean, literally, he was his personal servant, his personal bodyguard, his personal sort of like carriage guy. They interacted on a day to day basis, and um, over time, Washington's views on slavery, and no, most likely because of his interactions with William Lee, uh, changed. And it got to the point where before he died, he was attempting to manumit a lot of his slaves, but per the law, and I didn't know this, per the law, you couldn't actually manumit your slaves. Um, in Virginia at that time. You couldn't manumit slaves that didn't belong to you, and most of his enslaved people were his wife's. And his wife was far less sympathetic than he was towards uh, enslaved people.
Mm.
Or you couldn't manumit inherited slaves. So the slaves he inherited did not technically belong to him. They were his wife's side of the family and had been inherited, but he legally could not free them. Um,
there's a difference, I think, between there's it's important to remember history, but I think also it's important to not venerate history in a
True,
sense,
absolutely.
even with great figures. And I think one of the more controversial picks, because Jefferson, I think it's easy to split him down the middle. I think one of the most interesting historical figures in terms of non venerating them is Winston Churchill, who was a massive bigot, a massive piece of shit, very right wing in a lot of ways, fundamentally believed a lot of like very dark things about the environment and about the Indian people and things like that, caused genocides and Indian famines by redirecting their food away to Britain in order to win the war. But also, without him, Europe would have fallen. So I think that's a very fascinating figure where the things, unlike Jefferson, where you can parse the good and bad things separately, a lot of Winston Churchill's acts were acts of great evil and goodness,
Yeah, it's
simultaneously.
yeah, and he is very important to many people in the United Kingdom, and that's one of those, it's one of those perspectives that requires a great deal of reconciliation. Because again, I'm sure to people living in India, your fucking family starved to death because he redirected resources to the United Kingdom. Um, it's really hard. I think the veneration of historical figures is also a really hard thing to parse. America has sort of a civil religion that we live by. It's a very interesting concept where the idea is that because America is not linked together by any definitive ethnic or religious group, we've kind of transposed our desires for religiosity and sort of, I guess, like meaning that you could get through ethnicity or other, some other, abstract concept. We've sort of transposed that um, onto civil religion, which is sort of a almost religious. And you can, if you go into the Capitol building and look up, there is a mural of George Washington and other founding fathers. It's like the Sistine Chapel. It was meant, I mean, from what I've researched, it was meant to be similar to the Sistine Chapel, of Washington sitting in heaven surrounded by angels. One of them, I think, is holding the Constitution. The other is holding a sword with an American shield. And this sort of religious veneration of these figures, I can't remember who spoke of the idea. They argued that it was meant to fill the gap, since America is an idea, not an ethnicity or a religion. It's we are a civil democracy, and a civic nationalism is kind of the way we've historically conducted ourselves, as opposed to ethnic nationalism, which that's the way many other countries have gone about forming. Um, that in the absence of religion, ethnicity, race, whatever you want to say, we've fallen upon almost a civic veneration of individual historical figures like George Washington, like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, the founding fathers, quote unquote, as well as our documents and our sort of monuments. And so I think it's hard. Like I don't know what I'm curious about Fowler is like, do you think there is a way? Like, do you think veneration of historical figures is always going to be something that is sort of that happens in any sort of like society?
I think so. I think you need to prop up figures to create like a sense of community and togetherness of the nation. And I think they're also kind of necessary in a propagandistic sense as like a successful model of what your country can do. I mean, the great historical figures are like sock puppets manipulated by the living in order to push their agenda, whatever it may be.
Yes. I would also add to the civic religion rant I went on, Martin Luther King Jr., and that concept of equality, egalitarianism, reconciliation, that has also entered America's civil religion. Um, um, which I think is just absolutely fascinating if we're, talking about how we remember history.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think more so in agreement with you that it's a tool that you can use. Um, you should always seek. on an individual level to put aside your own current biases and to look upon history just as it happened. Just be impartial. Thomas Jefferson's dead. I mean, this is what I say to people who gripe about it. He's dead. He ain't coming back. He can't hurt you. um, he and everybody in his life are dead and gone. And um, there is utility always in viewing history from that lens because it allows you to say, okay, like Fowler said, what is good and what is not good? What can we learn and what should we toss aside? Um, the, liberty, justice, democracy, which Jefferson championed. I mean, it's what's allowed us to function as a society. I mean, we wouldn't have the United States without him. So I don't, you know what I mean. Um, but the slavery thing, not ideal, and I think we decided that. Uh, we decided, uh, however many years later, uh, that slavery was not cool and that we would stop doing that. So he lost that battle, but he definitely won others. Are you still there, Fowler?
I'm just thinking. Uh, I think ultimately one of the things that we should think about is what the figures that we emulate mean for our society. Are you emulating people who are truly vicious and imperialistic, and a lot of the thing that you venerate them for is strength? Are you pushing for people because of a sense of equality or fairness? And I think it's very interesting which figures people connect to for what reason. Um, I think a really interesting example of this is like Trump's veneration of Andrew Jackson. Um,
Boy, Andy. Sorry.
one of our worst presidents in a lot of ways, and one of our most dangerous presidents.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Well, Jackson was sort of the proto-fascist. He was the proto-fascistic. Um, I don't know if he was cruel. I mean, I don't know if he was deliberately. I don't know if he deliberately took pleasure in the suffering of others. Although he came. I mean, he's probably the one powerful figure I'd say came damn near close in American history to coming off that way. Um, but it makes sense as to why someone like Trump would um, gravitate towards someone like Jackson. And Jackson's reputation has always been in the shitter. I mean, I don't know anybody who I don't know anybody even before Black Lives Matter who was like, yeah, who would feel comfortable proclaiming that their favorite president was Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, he did a lot of Trail Tears, genocide of Native Americans. He did a lot of sussy shit,
Nice.
collapsing the banks.
That's he is one guy that I'm like, I don't think I've ever heard anybody back in, even when I learned about him in school fucking 12 years ago. I was like, damn. Everybody was like, ooh, he's a bit much. I was, well, he's a little too out there for my liking. Um,
Well, I think a lot of it is a dog whistle. Jackson represented the white working class, and I think he's used symbolically as a way of pushing for overtly racial politics without overtly saying it.
Definitely.
That's how I'd perceive it, at least.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Um,
Because historical figures are also symbols. People say that you're endorsing these historical figures in order to make points about what you actually are dog whistling, what you actually believe.
yeah. Um, yeah, and I think Trump saying he likes Jackson is really interesting because Trump has made no indication that he knows anything about history. Uh, so him picking Jackson, I think, is pretty overt because it's like, I mean, if he were fucking, just oh, I don't know, George Washington, you know what I mean? Like, um, but he chose Jackson specifically. Um, and Jackson definitely is not an obscure figure, but he is a controversial one, and he is known as being a controversial one. Um, so it's.
I feel like we've asked more questions than we have given answers
I mean,
on this
what do
podcast.
we what kind of fucking answers do we need to give to people? I mean, it's history. You can't answer history. It's like it is so entirely a sort of independent interpretation of the facts, and I think it's also a touchy subject to talk about because it's you know your viewpoint on history and how you view history can reveal so much about your current politics, especially American history. I mean, if I were to come up here and say like, man, your boy Andy Jackson, love what he did. People would make a lot of assumptions about my political my political viewpoints. Um, you know, or oh man, FDR, dude, based. Like right then and there where I'm leaning if I were to say something like
Yeah,
that.
FDR is that's a positive dog whistle when people are pro FDR.
Yeah. Um, so I think that's why we probably ask more questions to the audience than we've answered because there is no answer. I mean, the answer is like, I mean, my answer would be that you should use history as a tool in order to learn, and that learning history and learning about these historical figures is very important. And I wish we would do a better job about that in school. Although, I mean, at this point, that's all, the education situation. That's a whole different fucking discussion. I don't know if you want to get into that.
No, it's okay.
How would
That
you
might be
solve
another
that
entire.
problem, Fowler? How would you solve the educational crisis in the United States? Give me your 5 point uh, policy plan for how you would make it so that children in America are not reading at like a second grade level when they're fucking 15.
Listen, if I could fix America's education system, not only would I be the president, but I would be accepting like my second Nobel
Yeah,
Prize.
you'd be getting like fucking. You'd be the chair of the United Nations or some shit like that. Like you'd be fucking.
It would no longer be the Nobel Prize. It would be the Fowler Prize.
Yeah, it would be like Fowler solved. Fowler solves America in 2 seconds. Um, I think if I were to say though, like, I mean, in all seriousness, we're talking about history, so, and I'm sure y'all want to know, like, okay, fucking idiots, get to the point. Uh, the point is that history is complicated. This is what we spent 31 minutes telling you. History is hard. History is uncomfortable. History is very very difficult. Um, you should always weigh the positives and negatives, and it should be taught truthfully, accurately, but also there is usage from in a more broad sense for for what it means to a country. The United States were a very unique example because, like I said, we have that civic religion, and I think that civic religion is okay. I'm not knocking it. Um, I think any country or any group, in order to maintain a sense of community and cohesion, has to have central figures that sort of tie its ethos together. Um, and I think that with 2020 and sort of the emergence of just new technology that allows us to analyze history from a different angle, I think a lot of that is it's almost become complex in a way that a lot of people don't know how to do with. I mean, part of maintaining a civic religion is that these people, these individuals, the Thomas Jeffersons, the George Washingtons, they are these sort of larger than life figures that appear somewhat faultless, if not flawed, to a small degree. But it's all about how you interpret the data, I think, on a more macro level. Would you agree with that, Fowler?
Yeah, you might need to elaborate on the macro. I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, macro is in like, like if we're talking like in a classroom or as an individual. When I say macro, I mean like how do we as a society, um, Like, how do we hold these figures, and in what regard do we hold these figures? That's more so what I'm saying on the macro.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Do you have anything else to add, Fowler? Because let me see the time. Hitting 35, we're good. So you wanna dab us out, but don't actually dab. Don't do that, please.
Dabbing is you're dating yourself, Ardot.
I don't know what you're talking about.
That's the problem there.
I don't know. I don't know. I just said just sounded cool. Dab us out. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what that means.
Be skeptical of your history. Tear down your heroes. Love no one. That's my analysis of this conversation.
It's fucking useless. Jesus Christ. Why do I always carry these podcasts with my insightful and intelligent analysis?
All right, what you summarize? You make your great overarching point then.
I did. That's why I'm asking you. I just made my great overarching point. I'm asking you to make your great overarching point, and you just said like, fucking. You said the fucking outro to The Boys. Like, what do you?
I haven't seen that show yet. I've heard it's good.
You've watched it. You've told me you've watched it before. Don't lie.
I've
Don't
only
lie to the
watched
people.
first.
You're scared because you don't want to give. You're scared because you don't want to give your actual opinion that you told me about that show because you're scared you're gonna get canceled.
I don't remember whether I was a pro or anti.
That's
I'm
why.
a little scared to ask now.
You know what you said. I'm not going to say it. The people don't need to hear it. The people don't need to hear your opinion about your views on the boys. It's a good. I mean, it kind of relates to what we're saying. How do you view your heroes? And I don't know. I'm very pro America. I'm a little bit of a patriot myself, so I might be a little bit biased.
How could you ever say something so brave and yet so true, Ardot?
And yes, I am a POC. For those of y'all listening, we do exist. We've not been swept up yet. So there's plenty of us out here. We're fucking red-blooded Americans. We're ready to fucking go. Fowler, why don't you fucking sign us out? I ain't got nothing else to say.
We are the Week Old Beans podcast. Feel free to like and subscribe, and we will hit you up in the next video.